Welcome to Just Stories. We hope you enjoy the story. The War of 1812, America's Second War of Independence, by Just Stories. Chapter 1, A Nation Divided. The War of 1812 was a complex and divisive conflict that had far-reaching implications for the United States. In this chapter, we'll explore the political, economic, and social factors that contributed to the nation's divided state at the outbreak of the war. A nation on the rise in the early 19th century, the United States was a nation on the rise. The country was rapidly expanding westward, with new territories being acquired and settled. This expansion brought about significant economic growth, but it also created new challenges for the young nation. At the same time, tensions were rising with Britain, which was engaged in a global struggle against France. The U.S. was caught in the middle of this conflict, and it was struggling to assert its independence and sovereignty on the world stage. Trade and impressment. One of the primary sources of tension between the U.S. and Britain was trade. Britain had imposed trade restrictions on neutral countries like the U.S. to prevent them from trading with France. This policy had a major impact on the American economy, which relied heavily on exports. Another major issue was the impressment of American sailors. Britain was constantly in need of sailors to man its ships, and it often forcibly recruited American sailors into the British Navy. This practice outraged Americans, who saw it as a violation of their sovereignty and an attack on their rights. These issues, along with others such as British support for Native American tribes in the Northwest Territory and disputes over the Canadian border, all contributed to a growing sense of anger and frustration among Americans. Federalists versus Republicans. As tensions with Britain continued to rise, the nation became increasingly divided along political lines. At the time, there were two major political parties in the U.S., the Federalists and the Republicans. The Federalists were generally more conservative and pro-British, and they opposed the war effort. They believed that a war with Britain would be disastrous for the U.S. economy and would lead to a loss of American lives. They also argued that the war was unnecessary, as the issues at the heart of the conflict could be resolved through diplomatic means. The Republicans, on the other hand, were more progressive and pro-war. They believed that the U.S. needed to assert its independence and defend its sovereignty against British aggression. They saw the war as a chance to expand American territory and increase the nation's standing in the world. The war begins despite the opposition of the Federalists. The U.S. declared war on Britain in June of 1812. The early years of the conflict were marked by a series of setbacks for the U.S., including the invasion of Canada and the burning of Washington, D.C. However, the tide of the war began to turn in the U.S.'s favor in 1813, with key victories at the Battle of Lake Erie and the Battle of the Thames. In conclusion, the War of 1812 was a complex and divisive conflict that reflected the growing tensions between the U.S. and Britain, as well as the divisions within American society. As we'll see in later chapters, the war had a profound impact on American history and identity, shaping the nation's future in ways that are still felt today. Chapter 2, The Tide of Battle. The War of 1812 was fought on both land and sea, with major battles and campaigns taking place throughout North America. In this chapter, we'll explore some of the most important battles and their impact on the course of the war. The invasion of Canada. One of the first major campaigns of the War of 1812 was the U.S. invasion of Canada. The invasion began in July of 1812, with an American force of 2,500 men crossing into Canada. The campaign was initially successful, with the U.S. capturing the British fort at Mackinac Island and winning the Battle of Detroit. However, the tide of the war quickly turned against the U.S. In August of 1812, a British force led by General Isaac Brock captured the city of Detroit, forcing the U.S. to abandon its invasion of Canada. The U.S. attempted a second invasion in 1813, but this campaign was also unsuccessful, with the U.S. suffering a major defeat at the Battle of York. Naval battles. While the U.S. struggled on land, it had greater success on the high seas. The U.S. Navy, led by figures such as Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry and Captain James Lawrence, won a number of key victories over the British Navy. One of the most significant naval battles of the war was the Battle of Lake Erie, which took place in September of 1813. In this battle, Perry led a U.S. force to victory over a British fleet, capturing or destroying all 6 British ships. The U.S. victory at Lake Erie helped secure control of the Great Lakes and was a major turning point in the war. Another important naval battle was the Battle of New Orleans, which took place in January of 1815. Although the battle took place after the war had technically ended, it was a significant victory for the U.S., with General Andrew Jackson leading a force of soldiers, sailors, and volunteers to defeat a much larger British army. The burning of Washington. One of the most infamous events of the War of 1812 was the burning of Washington, which took place in August of 1814. In this attack, a British force led by General Robert Ross captured the U.S. Capitol and set fire to many of its public buildings, including the White House and the Capitol. The attack on Washington was a major blow to the U.S., but it also had a significant impact on the course of the war. It increased support for the war effort among Americans, and it inspired a new sense of patriotism and national pride. In conclusion, the War of 1812 was a complex and multifaceted conflict that was fought on both land and sea. While the U.S. struggled on land, it had greater success at sea, with a number of significant naval victories. The burning of Washington was a low point for the U.S., but it also helped to galvanize the nation and increase support for the war effort. Chapter 3: The Home Front. While the battles of the War of 1812 were fought on distant shores, the impact of the war was felt deeply on the home front. In this chapter, we'll explore the ways in which the war affected daily life for Americans and the role of civilians in the conflict. War financing. One of the most significant challenges facing the U.S. during the War of 1812 was financing the war effort. Unlike later conflicts, such as the Civil War, the U.S. did not have a national bank or a well-established system of government financing. Instead, the U.S. government relied on loans from private citizens and banks to fund the war. This system of financing was highly volatile, and it led to significant fluctuations in the value of government bonds and currency. Despite these challenges, however, the U.S. government was able to finance the war through a combination of loans and taxation. Economic impact. The War of 1812 had a significant impact on the American economy. The disruption of trade with Britain and other European nations led to a sharp decline in exports, and many American merchants and farmers suffered significant financial losses. At the same time, however, the war also created new economic opportunities. The demand for war supplies, such as weapons, ammunition, and uniforms, created new industries and stimulated economic growth in certain regions of the country. Women in the war effort. While men were the primary combatants in the War of 1812, women also played an important role in the conflict. Women on the home front were responsible for managing households and businesses in the absence of their male relatives. Many women also contributed to the war effort in more direct ways. They sewed uniforms, made bandages, and wrote letters to soldiers on the front lines. Women's organizations, such as the Ladies' Patriotic Association, also raised money and supplies for the war effort. African Americans and the war. African Americans also played a significant role in the War of 1812. Many free black men served in the U.S. military, and some even rose to positions of leadership, such as Colonel Charles Ball and Major General James Wilkinson. Enslaved Africans and African Americans were also involved in the war effort, although their experiences were often more complex. Some enslaved individuals were able to gain their freedom by serving in the military or providing other support to the war effort. Others were forced to labor on behalf of the U.S. government or the British Army. The legacy of the War of 1812 had a profound impact on American history and identity. It marked a significant turning point in the nation's development, both in terms of its relationship with Britain and its internal politics and economy. The war also had a lasting impact on the experiences of women and African Americans in the U.S. It helped to shape the nation's understanding of patriotism and national identity, and it contributed to a sense of American exceptionalism that continues to this day. In conclusion, the War of 1812 had a significant impact on the home front, affecting daily life for Americans and shaping the nation's development. Women and African Americans played important roles in the conflict, and their contributions helped to shape the legacy of the war. Chapter 4: Negotiating Peace. The War of 1812 was a long and difficult conflict, but by 1814, both the U.S. and Britain were ready to negotiate an end to the fighting. In this chapter, we'll explore the diplomatic efforts that led to the end of the war and the legacy of the conflict for both the U.S. and Britain. The Treaty of Ghent. The peace negotiations that led to the end of the War of 1812 took place in Ghent, Belgium. The negotiations were difficult and contentious, with both sides pushing for different terms. In the end, however, a peace treaty was signed on December 24, 1814. The Treaty of Ghent did not address many of the issues that had led to the war, such as trade restrictions and impressment, but it did establish a framework for future negotiations. The treaty also restored the status quo ante bellum, meaning that all territories and possessions were to be returned to their pre-war state. This meant that the U.S. did not gain any new territory as a result of the war. The Battle of New Orleans. While the Treaty of Ghent was signed in December of 1814, news of the peace did not reach the U.S. until February of 1815. This meant that the Battle of New Orleans, which took place on January 8, 1815, was fought after the war had technically ended. The battle was a significant victory for the U.S., with General Andrew Jackson leading a force of soldiers, sailors, and volunteers to defeat a much larger British army. The victory at New Orleans helped to secure American control of the Mississippi River and was a major boost to American morale. The legacy of the War of 1812 had a profound impact on both the U.S. and Britain, shaping the course of their respective histories. For the U.S., the war marked a significant turning point in the nation's development, establishing its independence and sovereignty and boosting its confidence on the world stage. For Britain, the war had significant economic and political implications. The country was left with a massive debt and had to shift its focus away from global conflict and towards domestic issues. The war also had a lasting impact on American culture and identity. It helped to shape the nation's understanding of patriotism and nationalism, and it contributed to the development of a distinctly American culture and identity. In conclusion, the end of the War of 1812 was marked by difficult and contentious negotiations, but ultimately resulted in a peace treaty that established a framework for future relations between the U.S. and Britain. The war had a lasting impact on both countries, shaping their histories and their cultures in significant ways. Chapter 5: Remembering the War. The War of 1812 may not be as well remembered as other conflicts in American history, such as the Revolutionary War or the Civil War, but it had a profound impact on the nation's development. In this chapter, we'll explore the ways in which the war has been remembered and commemorated over the years. Monuments and memorials. One of the most visible ways in which the War of 1812 has been remembered is through monuments and memorials. There are a number of monuments and memorials dedicated to the war throughout the U.S. and Canada, including the Fort McHenry National Monument in Baltimore, Maryland, and the War of 1812 Museum in Toronto, Ontario. These monuments and memorials serve as reminders of the sacrifices made by those who fought and died in the conflict, and they help to ensure that the memory of the war is kept alive for future generations. Literature and art. The War of 1812 has also been remembered through literature and art. There are a number of books, poems, and songs that have been written about the war, including Francis Scott Key's The Star-Spangled Banner, which became the national anthem of the U.S. in 1931. Artists have also depicted the war in their work, with famous examples including Emanuel Lewitz's Washington Crossing the Delaware and Charles Wilson Peele's The Battle of Germantown. Commemorative events, such as parades and reenactments, have also played an important role in remembering the War of 1812. In 2012, the U.S. and Canada held a joint bicentennial commemoration of the war, with a series of events held throughout the year. These events included parades, reenactments, and concerts, as well as educational programs and exhibits. The bicentennial commemoration helped to raise awareness of the war and its significance in American and Canadian history. Legacy and impact. The War of 1812 had a significant impact on American history and identity, and its legacy can still be felt today. The war helped to establish the U.S. as a sovereign and independent nation, and it played a significant role in shaping the nation's cultural and political identity. The war also had a lasting impact on the experiences of women and African Americans in the U.S., and it contributed to the development of a distinctly American culture and identity. In conclusion, the War of 1812 may not be as well known as other conflicts in American history, but it had a profound impact on the nation's development. The war has been remembered through monuments, literature, and commemorative events, and its legacy can still be felt today in American culture and identity. Thank you for watching our story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss out on our next video.